Hey everybody, this is Mr. Arvites. Due to Hurricane Ida, obviously we're not in class, but we're going to do a little lesson on the Declaration of Independence, and then we're going to move on to the American Revolution. So this is probably going to be one of about 3 or 4 YouTube videos on this topic. So let's get started. Prior to the Declaration of Independence, we have to understand, right, with the battles of Lexington and Concord, the American Revolution kicks off in 1775. The Second Continental Congress, which meets right at the end of that year, at the beginning of 1776, is kind of tasked with solving this issue. For a lot of the members of that Continental Congress, they didn't want independence. A lot of them really just want to be recognized by the British. They want an end to hostilities, and they really desperately want there to not be a war. And there are a couple of principal players that we often talk about when we talk about the Second Continental Congress. One is John Dickinson. John Dickinson kind of gets a bad rap because he's like the major antagonist in the John Adams miniseries. He's also in the play 1776 is kind of like the bad guy, if you will. Really, John Dickinson is from Pennsylvania. He is the senior delegate of Pennsylvania. And he is someone who does not believe that they can win the American Revolution. He believes in enlightened ideas. He believes in a lot of the philosophies like natural rights, but he does not think that the colonies, so not the United States yet, have the ability to actually win the American Revolution. And so he's against a full-scale war. What he really wants is a peace treaty. He's going to write the Olive Branch Petition, which is really, really important. It's the last kind of outreach that the Continental Congress will give to King George before moving to a more independent feel of things. Another major character that I think is important to note is Edward Rutledge. Edward Rutledge is from South Carolina. He's a South Carolina planter. Depending on your descriptions of him, he can be kind of that aristocratic plantation owner type that you see from the South. And he represents a lot of the southern states, not just South Carolina, but North Carolina. You could argue he represents a lot of the opinions in Georgia as well, Maryland in there as well. And he doesn't want the American Revolution because he feels like it's bad for business. And that's the way a lot of these planters really operated. And keep in mind, a lot of the plantation owners were involved in various protest movements because plantation owners had long felt that they were not getting a fair shake in the British economic system. But he is another one who doesn't think that the American Revolution can be won, especially by the quote-unquote peasant class, right, in the United States at the time. So he's kind of against it. Some other major players, obviously, we see George Washington, who is going to be made the commander-in-chief of the army, so he won't even be involved in this process. But Benjamin Franklin is at this one, and Ben Franklin, arrived from England and is going to give the leaders of the colonies a new outlook on the British kind of opinion of the North American colonists and, of course, of the Continental Congress, because there was a lot of dismay in Parliament. They thought it was a treasonous grouping, which, according to the Crown, it was. They're all kind of treasonous, if you will, right? And so Ben Franklin's there. But then you get the Adamses, right? Sam and John Adams, cousins from Boston, Massachusetts. They're kind of the firebrands of that Sons of Liberty type movement, though John Adams not an original member of that, Sam being an original member. And they're really going to push for independence and war. And even at the beginning, I think you see very early on that the people from Boston have this breakaway mindset that's there. Virginia shares that opinion in a lot of ways, and that is made very evident by the young delegate from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson is actually an interesting character because most people who haven't read about history don't know much about Jefferson outside of the fact that he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was the third president of the United States, right? He has a cool memorial in D.C. Jefferson is in a lot of ways, shy individual. He doesn't do big speeches. John Adams does big speeches. Jefferson's a writer. He's quiet. He's meticulous in how he thinks, but he's actually an extremist. He really does want this whole thing to blow up. He wants a revolution, and we'll see that with Jefferson going forward when he's vice president. He often talked about revolutions being needed at times. And so Jefferson's going to be a big-time figure. Obviously, he's the writer of the Declaration of Independence. Another is John Hancock, who a lot of you know John Hancock as the, kind of smuggler in Boston who is smuggling in goods amidst the protest movements of the 1760s. John Hancock is going to be elected the president of the Continental Congress. And that's important because he's going to be in charge, and he's going to be one of the guys who's principally getting the war effort underway. So let's talk about the actual Declaration of Independence. I guess before we we get there. One, we have to understand that it is inspired by other people. Okay, John Locke in particular has a lot of his work is very much used a lot in this. The idea of natural rights of man, right? These are all from the European Enlightenment. And when Thomas Jefferson writes these things, right, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator to certain inalienable rights. That phrase is very similar to things that you see in those Enlightenment philosophies. And so Jefferson is very well read. He has one of the largest private libraries in North America. And so that's what he does. He reads all these little treatises and he just puts together this magnificent document. Now, what's interesting about the actual declaration is that, one, not all the states were for it. And for it to get approved, they needed to get not just a majority, right? Because there's 13 colonies. So a majority of 13 would be 7. They actually needed to get 9. But really, for a Declaration of Independence to work, the idea was that they couldn't have any dissension. All states must approve it. And so that is the big issue, is how do you get all these states to approve it? Because in the Continental Congress, it's a very flawed system. Each state gets 1 vote. And that vote is cast by the senior delegate. So why is that difficult? Well, because in a state like Pennsylvania, for instance, the senior delegate being John Dickinson, Ben Franklin and the other delegates of Pennsylvania who were pro-independence, their votes didn't matter. It was John Dickinson's vote. So that's the guy you have to sway. And unfortunately for the independence movement, Dickinson and John Adams pretty much hated each other from the very beginning, and they got in arguments and kind of bashed each other all the time behind the scenes and in the scenes, if you will. The other colonies you had to really work on were the southern colonies, the Georgias of the world, South Carolina, North Carolina. They kind of all go where the wind's going to blow eventually, but they're really tricky to get them on board. And then lastly is New York. New York is a very interesting, New York and Pennsylvania actually together are very interesting because they have a lot of Tory sentiment, a lot of pro-British sentiment in those colonies, and it kind of creates a harder push for independence. Well, to kind of or make a long story short, over time, throughout the spring of 1776, it becomes very clear that this movement needs to happen, right? That they need to have this independence movement. But there's actually going to be a piece of writing that changes the whole trajectory of this. And that is going to be Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Common Sense is one of the most, I think, unique pieces of literature that you find in history, because it's written right at the beginning of 1776. And it is so on the needle for where the political sway was in the colonies. And the title Common Sense is there because the idea that independence is not something that is a mystery. It's common sense. It should be independent. And he points out throughout the pamphlet that these colonies have their own militaries, they have their own economic systems, they have their own governments. They should be able to run themselves, and that a free people shouldn't be subject to a people who don't represent them, being Parliament or being the king. And Thomas Paine really does hit the nail on the head with this, and it gets distributed massively throughout the colonies. You're talking over 100,000 people, or over 200,000 people or so, are going to end up buying this, and then even more so once you factor in widespread readings of it, which is insane because the population isn't that big in North America. So this document really does kind of shift the bar. There's some other things that actually do help as well. They had some British raids on small towns on coastlines. In Virginia in particular, the British decided to essentially just siege their 2 major ports, and they destroyed them. And that created a whole bunch of hostility because you destroyed all these people's homes and their livelihood. And so it makes the British out to be the villain in this. And so that's going to be another big factor, is that public sentiment is going to be against the British because they make a bunch of miscalculations on trying to put this rebellion down. So as the vote goes, and by the way, let's take this away. There is no July 4th signing of it or July 4th vote on it. The vote happens before. The signing takes place for a month afterwards because none of the delegates are actually there. They had to go back home and get approval and everything else. But July 4th is the day that they stick with. Thomas Jefferson is going to be put on a committee with Benjamin Franklin and John Adams to write this document, a Declaration of Independence. Now, originally, it was just there in case independence was going to be declared, and eventually that becomes the say-so. And the 2 major characters who debate this in Congress are going to be John Adams and John Dickinson. Dickinson makes a very good case. Again, he believes that the British Army is going to overwhelm the colonial army. And he's not wrong. The British Army is, superior in terms of firepower. They have way more cannons than the Americans do. Experience, leadership, all these different things factor in the British's favor. And it's a very pessimistic view. And the analogy he kind of uses, he says, to fight the British Army would be like braving a storm in a skiff made of paper, right? A paper boat. And so that doesn't seem very, very likely. He predicts Native American uprisings, which will occur, obviously, slave uprisings, which also will occur. But he also predicts infighting with the states, and he says that they'll tear each other apart before they ever get to be independent anyway. John Adams, on the other hand, depicts a hopeful view of independence, one that is there for future generations. And that's the actual thing that we see a lot in the writings of George Washington in his journals and letters. He talks about the war for independence being for future generations. And we see that a whole lot. Now, getting to the actual document itself, Thomas Jefferson puts forth a lot of effort to write this, meticulously puts it together, and it's going to be picked apart by Benjamin Franklin in particular, and John Adams to a degree. Jefferson is going to outline a lot of reasons for independence. And these are the various laws that we've actually already talked about. Quartering Act, right, is put into Townshend Acts, and talks about just various illegal taxations. He also is going to fault the Crown for slavery. And it's interesting because Thomas Jefferson owns, at the time of the Declaration of Independence, he owns right around 179 to 181 slaves, somewhere around there. And he is kind of laying the fault of slavery, which Jefferson puts as immoral in the document, at the king. And it's an interesting kind of take. And that's part of Jefferson's persona for his entire political career, where he often, in writings and things will, bash slavery a lot, but he still owns slaves and never really makes an attempt to rectify that. Not like other people did, but Jefferson is fairly hypocritical with this. Now, that stuff never makes it into the actual Declaration of Independence. They could not put a condemnation of slavery in there. And Ben Franklin is one of the guys who says, look, you can't do that. And the reason for that is, imagine, trying to pitch this to the Georgia legislature or South Carolina, North Carolina, even some of the northern ones, because they still had slaves in some of these northern states. And so pitching that would have been very difficult and made it almost impossible. So they ended up editing it out. And there's a whole bunch of stuff they edit out. And Ben Franklin really does kind of make it more of a universal document. And that was one of the unique things about the Declaration of Independence. It's not just the United States declaring independence from Great Britain, but it's a declaration of rights for all people. And that's what makes it so unique. And that's what made it, I think, ripple throughout history. And even though the ideas of the Declaration of Independence are not made into reality, like, let's be very honest, the idea that all men are created equal doesn't happen in the United States, doesn't happen for a long time in the United States, especially not politically or socially and everything else. You have racism, you have slavery, obviously, for the first half, you have women, are they included in this? And so all of these things kind of factor in. But MLK talked about this document in a couple of speeches where he talked about it as a promissory note, right? And he would say, somewhere I read that this was the case. And he does that in a number of speeches. And throughout history, throughout U.S. history, the Declaration of Independence has been used as a rationale for civil liberties and civil rights all the way to present day. And so it's a everlasting kind of ripple effect. Well, as the document does get approved on July 2nd and 3rd, and then eventually the signatures begin, it gets publicly read on July 4th, which is hence Independence Day. Right. And so it becomes this big declaration, essentially a declaration of war on Britain. Now, part of the declaration is really important because what it does is it outlines the fact that the United States has the power to make treaties with whatever country it wants. And so the Declaration of Independence, in some ways, is not even designed to go to England. It's designed to go to France. It's designed to go to Russia. It's designed to go to the German states. Anyone who might not like Britain, Spain included in there, send it to them because they might be able to send us weapons and arms. Because the reality is, and John Dickinson actually predicted this, the reality is that we can't win this war without foreign assistance, and it won't be won without foreign assistance. The United States is going to get aid from virtually every major power in Europe to help it out. And that's really what the Declaration of Independence does, is it shows them that we're leaving and that we're independent. We have our own government already, and so it kind of gives some stability. But they're not going to give us help right away, as we'll talk about in the next video as we look at the American Revolution. They're not going to give us help right away on that. Now, as far as the actual voting of it went, most of the states began to fall in line by June of 1776. And really, The only holdouts, you had John Dickinson is holding out. Rutledge in South Carolina basically says, as long as you can get everyone else to vote for this, I am voting for it. And that brings the southern states in. Dickinson is basically convinced not to show up. And because he doesn't show up, Ben Franklin votes for it, and that is how it gets approved. And so the Declaration of Independence is approved unanimously. The only state that doesn't is New York. New York does not vote on it. They abstain from the vote. They will eventually ratify it. But the reason New York didn't vote on it is because ships are now appearing off the coast of Manhattan. And the British are about to unleash a massive, massive force, over 20,000 strong, to invade New York and dislodge the American presence there. And so that will be the first kind of tale of the war itself, is once independence happens, what happens there. So that is the Declaration of Independence. You really do need to read through it. And when you read through the Declaration of Independence, I highly recommend looking at the various laws and things that happened throughout the 1760s and 70s and see how many of them are in there and see if you can pinpoint those. Well, that is it for this lesson. It's Mr. Arvites. You guys take it easy.